This is going to be a quick tutorial on making this pyramid little pouch bag. If you have more questions or need more in-depth videos, I have lots of other tutorials on my YouTube and TikTok, or you can just reach out to me and I'll do my best to help you out. The process is super similar to making one of my chapstick holders, so if you've made one of those before, you can skim through a lot of this tutorial. We'll start by stringing up the first section of beads, and it's really easy. You just go left to right and top to bottom, just like reading a book. So I'd start by stringing up 3 of these light blue beads, then 13 of the dark blue, 4, and so on and so forth until I finish that first section of beads. When I come to section 2, I'll stop stringing up beads, and I'll take my needle off, and then we're ready to start crocheting. We'll start by crocheting this loop, but it's an optional part of the project, so if you don't want it, you don't have to include it. Before you start crocheting, you want to make sure that you have a pretty long tail, at least 1.5 times around the bag, but if you do it a little bit more, that will be totally fine. But you just want to give yourself enough working room because we're going to be crocheting around the tail as we start the bag. Once we have that nice long tail, we'll start off pretty simply with chaining about 20 stitches. If you want your loop to be a little bit bigger, you can do more, and if you want it to be smaller, you can do less. So this part's kind of up to you. The number doesn't have to be exact. Once I finish my chain, I'm going to go into each loop, just doing a single crochet, going back towards the beginning, and then this is what it looks like as I'm just finishing up that last stitch. So you can see it's not super thick after doing our chain and then our first row of single crochet. So I'm going to go back one more time. I'll start by doing a chain and then I'll do a single crochet into each stitch going back in the other direction, and that'll thicken it up a nice amount. If you want it more thick, you can go back and forth a couple more times, or if you like the way it is, then we can work on the next step. Now that I have my strip finished, I'm going to connect the 2 ends together to turn it into that little loop. And since I did 3 rows, including my initial chain, I'm going to connect it in 3 spots. So you can see I start by just putting my hook through the other corner. That's kind of what it looks like. And then you can choose to either do a normal single crochet or more of a slip stitch. Either way will work to connect it together. So once you have the first one done, then you can put your hook through the middle and do the middle stitch to connect it together, and then we'll do one more at the end. And once we have those 3 stitches connecting it together, we're going to start working on our chain that goes around the very top of the little pouch that we're making. Somewhere near the top of your pattern, it'll say the width or the number of stitches around, and that's how many we need to chain to create the very top of the bag. So on this pattern, it's 95. On others, it might be different, so make sure you just double check that. We'll be crocheting around our long tail as we create the top of the bag, so make sure you're holding it in such a way that you can crochet around it. You can see how I like to hold it, and that just keeps it nice and tight, and it makes it a little bit easier to crochet around the tail. So you'll want to make sure that you do all of the stitches that you're supposed to, and the few stitches that you did to create the loop count towards that stitch count. So I have 95 that I have to do, minus the 3 that I've already done when I connected my loop together. Once we finish doing the correct number of stitches, we'll connect the end we just finished on back to the beginning, and we want to make sure that we don't get a twist in our long chain as we connect this. If you get a twist, your whole work will end up twisted and it won't work out in the end. So you want to be pretty careful and methodical as you're working on connecting these 2 sides. So I start by grabbing pretty close to the hook, and then I run my fingers over the work and I straighten it out as I go. So if I run into a part that's twisted, I twist it in the other direction, and I just try to keep it in one nice even line. So if you look a little bit closer, it's kind of hard to tell with this white thread, but I have all of my stitches for my chain kind of on the bottom, and then the tail that I've been crocheting around is on the top all the way across the work. Once you're sure you have all the twists out, you can find the very first stitch, and then we'll be putting our hook into that stitch. And we're going to just grab one of the loops. The way I have it oriented, it'll be the bottommost loop. We also refer to it as the back loop. So I'm putting my hook right into that, and then I'll twist it around so that it's in a normal position to start crocheting with. Before I crochet these two ends together, I'm just going to pull my tail back over my hook so that I'm still crocheting around it for a little bit longer. And then we're going to crochet a few more stitches before we start adding beads. So I'll go about 5 or so stitches and still crocheting around that tail, just connecting the beginning back to the end and kind of strengthening things up a little bit before we start adding the beads on. After you get a few stitches in, you can grab a small section of beads and bring them to the very front of your work, and then we're going to keep crocheting around the tail for a little bit longer. I like to go maybe a third or a half of the way through the pouch before I stop crocheting around the tail. So I'm going to do a few more stitches around it and just starting to add 1 bead for every stitch. And it's pretty simple to crochet with beads. You just do like a normal single crochet, but you add 1 bead for each stitch. When you've reached far enough to stop crocheting around the tail, don't cut it off yet. We want to leave it until we get a little bit further into the bag, because we can use it to make some adjustments on how tight that first row is. So you can just kind of put it off to the side and keep crocheting. When I have just a few stitches left, I like to pull up my pattern again to make sure that I have the right number of count in my very first row. So this is one of the easiest places to make a mistake. If your stitch numbers are off by 1 or 2, it'll mess up the whole pattern, but I have a built-in way to check that you have everything right. So you'll want to just grab your pattern, and you may have noticed as you were stringing up the first section of beads that there was one with either a different colored number or a different colored outline. For this one, it has a slightly different green outline, and that indicates the very last bead of the first row. So this is the last bead that you should crochet into a normal stitch before you start crocheting into stitches with beads. So you'll want to compare the beads that you've already crocheted with this pattern. You started with the very end of the pattern as the beginning of your crocheting, and you worked your way in the opposite direction as you strung the beads. So you can kind of check between your pattern and your work to see exactly which bead should be the last bead of your first row, and then make sure that that actually is the last one. And once you've made sure that your count is correct, you're good to keep going. If you're off by a couple stitches, you can either do 2 beads into 1 space, or you can skip a space, and that will kind of compensate for either having too many or too few stitches. So you can do a little bit of working around, but if your count is way off, you might want to pull it out and restart to make sure that that last bead is in fact the last bead of your first row as you're crocheting. With that first row done, you can just keep crocheting 1 bead into each space until you run out of beads and you need to start a new section. Or if you find a place where you added too many or too few beads, I'm going to show you how to change out your thread. This process is actually super easy. So you'll take your work that you need to change your thread on, and you'll pull your hook out a good ways away, and then you'll give yourself a nice tail on the other side, and you'll just cut your thread. Once you've threaded new beads or fixed the order of your messed up beads, you're ready to attach back on and keep crocheting. I start by taking my work and my hook, and I'm putting my hook through these 2 little loops that my working thread was just going through. Hopefully you can see well enough here what that looks like. Once I've done that, I'll set my work and my hook back down, and then I'm going to find a nice small section of beads. If it's too big, it'll be harder to work with. So I just make it nice and small so that I'm not worried about too many beads at once. And then I'll hold on to my new thread like I would hold on to my normal working thread. And then instead of holding it in my hands like this, I'm going to take it and just press it up against my work so that this extra thread doesn't come undone. So you do need to kind of hold it a little bit tight. And then once you have that, I just pull all these extra tails out of the way. You don't want to accidentally crochet into them in this very beginning part. So just pulling them off to the side like this is helpful. And then it's kind of like finishing off a normal single crochet. So you'll pull it through this loop, and then you're ready to start crocheting into the next space. So at this point, you'll want to pull these 2 tails forward. you have your tail from your old thread and from your new thread, and we're going to be crocheting around both of them as we go into the next few stitches. So I pull the loop off to the side still, and then I have my two tails on the other side so I can crochet around them. And then it's just kind of crocheting like normal, one bead into every stitch and just a single crochet. And the nice thing about this technique is that we're weaving our tails in as we go, so that you won't have to do that at the very end for everything. And you don't have to tie any knots, so it looks super clean, and you don't see any gaps in your beads on the other side. So I really like this technique, and it's not super hard once you figure out how to do it. Once I'm about an inch or so away from that point where I connected back on, I'll take my hook out, and we're going to get rid of this giant loop that we have left over. So you'll need to figure out which tail is the one that's actually connected to the loop. Sometimes you have to pull both of them. So I pulled the wrong one first, and now I have the right one. And you shouldn't have to pull too hard, but as you pull on it, you'll notice that this loop starts getting smaller and smaller. And you just want to go until the loop disappears, but you don't want to pull too tight or your stitches can scrunch up a little bit. So you can see right there, that's where it was, and it's pretty discreet. Like, you can barely tell that I changed my thread at this point. So it should look like that once you've pulled your loop through. You can keep crocheting a little bit longer. You don't need more than like a couple inches of crocheting around the tails before you can trim them off. It holds them in pretty tightly, so you don't have to worry too much about them coming unraveled or anything. So once I get a few inches away, I'll just trim my tails, or you can just leave them off to the side and wait until you get later on in the project and just trim all your tails at once. Once you reach the very end of your project, you can cut your string at the bottom and pull the loop all the way through to make sure it's secure. And then you can use this tail that we haven't trimmed yet at the very top to adjust your very first row of beads. So if it's looking super loose, you can pull on the tail a little bit and it'll act as a drawstring and tighten it up together. If your very first row is too tight together, you can just kind of stretch out the top, put your fingers inside and pull, and it should loosen it up a little bit. So once you have that, you can trim off this little string, the tail, from the very beginning, and then we'll start adding the zipper onto the bag. It's hard to find the exact right zipper length on the internet, so I found this one, and it's a little bit big, but I'm just going to trim it down to size. So I'll start by lining up that metal piece with one edge of this little purse bag thingy, and then the other end will be how long it needs to be, and then I add just like an inch or half an inch onto that length. And then I'm just going to cut it with a pair of scissors. So you might want to trim it one more time, make sure the zipper is actually in the section that you need it to be in before you cut it, and that's where I'm going to cut. So I'll just grab my pair of scissors and trim it right there. And you may have noticed that there's normally a little metal crimp to stop the zipper from coming off. I don't have a way of re-crimping it, but I used just like some string and I went around the teeth a couple times to block the zipper from coming off when I first made my bag, and it worked really well. So you can do that, or you can find some other method of just kind of blocking those zipper teeth so it can't come all the way off. And then we're going to add the zipper on first before we close up the bottom of the bag. And this is super helpful because you can turn it inside out if you need to. So you can see me doing that right here. It takes a little bit of fidgeting, but it can be kind of helpful to reach some of the hard to reach spots when it's right side out. So if you need to, you can turn it inside out for this process, and then we're just going to add the zipper on. I started sewing it on this end with a little metal piece, so I put it in the bag and hid underneath the edge, and then I start by doing a stitch in that corner there, and then I line it up with the rest of the bag and sew across. And once we get to the very end with this little loop, I just stopped sewing on the zipper itself, and I carried my stitch over to the other side so that I could sew down the other side of the zipper to the bag. So then I just kind of went in that direction and then finished it off, and I had a little zipper on the top of my bag. So it was kind of just figuring it out. I'm not an expert on attaching zippers, so I can't give you super great advice. But yeah, I just kind of started on one side, went around to the other side, and then I was ready to sew up the bottom of the bag. And there's not really any big trick to this either. You just sew it perpendicularly to the way that the zipper was attached, so it creates this fun triangle shape. If you don't want it to have that shape, you can just sew it up along the same side, but it's super easy. You just sew up the bottom, and then you have a cute little purse that you can put fun little things inside. I made this tutorial a little faster than I've made my other ones, so if there's any part that doesn't feel in-depth enough to you, or if you just have questions on any part of the process, please reach out to me and I'll do my best to help you out. And hopefully this is a fun project for you. Thanks for watching.